My name is Monica Ellison. I'm 27, and the moment that finally ended everything started with one sentence. My father looked at me and said they couldn't afford to take both of us on the trip. Then he said my brother would be the one going. That was it. No discussion, no pause, no hesitation. I nodded because that's what I always did. I didn't ask questions, didn't push back, didn't make it uncomfortable. From the outside, I probably looked calm, reasonable, even mature. Inside, though, something cracked in a way it never had before. It wasn't shock. It was recognition. That same familiar feeling I'd had my whole life, the quiet understanding that when something good came up, I wasn't really part of it. I was the one who stayed behind. At first, I told myself it was just a vacation, just money, just bad timing. I tried to convince myself I didn't care, that it wasn't worth turning into a problem. But that wasn't what hurt. What hit me was everything underneath it. The expectation. The certainty that while they planned, packed, and left, I would remain exactly where I always was, holding things together, handling responsibilities no one talked about, because they'd become my default role. They didn't ask if I was okay with staying. They didn't need to. They already knew the version of me they expected. And standing there listening, I realized they weren't just choosing who went on the trip. They were choosing who mattered in that moment. And they were sure I'd still be there when they came back, same house, same setup, same quiet compliance. That's when I stopped thinking about how to swallow it like I always had, and started thinking about something else entirely. For the first time, I wasn't planning how to adjust. I was planning how to leave. If you want to hear what happened next and what they came home to after that trip, stay with this story and follow along. Not long after that conversation, life in our house in Fishers slipped back into its familiar routine, but something underneath it had quietly shifted. The trip stopped being an abstract idea and turned into an actual plan, and every discussion about it slowly began to orbit around one person. Conversations that used to be casual became logistical, and somehow those conversations never required my input. I was always nearby, passing through rooms, hearing pieces of plans fall into place without me. When I did step into the space, the tone would change slightly, not to include me, but to soften the edges so I wouldn't challenge what had already been decided. My father explained it again in that calm, controlled way of his, saying it just made more sense this way. He didn't frame it as fair or unfair, just practical, as if practicality alone was enough to close the discussion. My mother stayed quiet, focusing on small tasks, agreeing with her silence, never quite meeting my eyes long enough for me to read what she was thinking. That silence wasn't accidental. It allowed everything to move forward without resistance. Joseph didn't seem conflicted at all. He talked about how exhausted he'd been, how much he needed the break, how good the trip would be for him. And there was no hesitation in his voice, no awareness that he was gaining something I wasn't. Then, almost casually, he said I was better with money anyway, like that single sentence explained the entire decision. No one corrected him. No one pushed back. The comment just sat there, accepted as if it were an established truth we all understood. I felt that familiar tightening in my chest, the moment where I usually decided whether to speak or let it go, and like so many times before I let it go. That choice didn't come from fear, it came from habit. Over the years, I'd learned that questioning decisions like this only made me seem difficult or ungrateful, and every time I tried to explain why something felt unfair, I was told I was overthinking it. Eventually, I started doing that work myself. I replayed conversations in my head, edited my reactions down, told myself I was being dramatic before anyone else could. I convinced myself that flexibility was maturity and that discomfort was simply part of being responsible. Watching them plan the trip made me realize how deeply I'd absorbed that role. I didn't just accept their explanations, I repeated them to myself until they felt true. I told myself it wasn't favoritism, just circumstances. I told myself I didn't really want to go. I told myself that needing less meant deserving less. Those thoughts came easily worn smooth by years of repetition, but this time they didn't settle the way they used to. The ease with which the decision moved forward, the way no one checked in with me, the way my presence didn't change the conversation at all, made those excuses feel thin. It became impossible to ignore that this wasn't a one-time choice made under pressure. It was a pattern that had been quietly running for years. Joseph was the one they planned for, the one they adjusted around. I was the one they relied on, the one expected to adapt without complaint. Those roles didn't need to be discussed because they had already been assigned. The trip didn't create that imbalance, it simply revealed it. I didn't argue that night or demand an explanation. I let the conversation end the way it always did, with me absorbing the discomfort so no one else had to. But instead of turning that discomfort inward and dismissing it, I held on to it. For the first time, I stopped convincing myself that nothing was wrong. I stayed quiet not because I agreed, but because I was finally paying attention to what I had been expected to accept all along. Later that night, when the house finally settled into silence and everyone else had gone to bed, I stayed at the kitchen table with my laptop open, not because I had planned to, but because sleep felt impossible. The quiet wasn't comforting. It was heavy, the kind that gives your thoughts too much room to organize themselves. I logged into my bank account without any clear intention, just following a familiar reflex, and watched the numbers load on the screen. At first, nothing seemed unusual, just balances and transactions I had seen before. But as I scrolled, patterns began to surface in a way they never had when I was rushing through my days. Payments showed up again and again: utilities, internet insurance, add-ons, subscriptions, repair charges, services that kept the house running smoothly without drawing attention to who was actually covering them. I opened old statements, then email confirmations I had saved and forgotten about, and the picture sharpened with every click. The furniture, the appliances, the accounts tied to the house, most of them were paid through me, managed by me, or fully in my name. It wasn't occasional help or shared responsibility, it was structure. I realized how many contracts were under my name, not because I demanded control, but because my credit had been better, more stable, easier to rely on. I remembered my father brushing it off years ago, saying it was just temporary, that once things evened out, we'd switch everything over, that it didn't really matter whose name was on the paperwork, as long as the bills were paid. At the time, I had accepted that explanation without question. Sitting there now alone in the dark, it sounded like something meant to delay a conversation that was never intended to happen. The realization didn't arrive with panic or anger, but with a slow, unsettling clarity. I wasn't just contributing to the household, I was quietly holding it together, and everyone had grown comfortable treating that as the natural order of things. I closed the laptop for a moment and let that settle, staring at the reflection of the room in the window, seeing it differently now that I understood what it was built on. For years, I had framed my role as being helpful, responsible, dependable. But none of those words changed the reality that I had become the foundation without ever being asked if I wanted that weight. When I picked up my phone and scrolled to Caleb Ross's name, there was no rush in my movements, no shaking hands, no dramatic hesitation. I called because I already knew what I needed to ask. When he answered, I didn't explain my family or justify myself. I asked about available apartments, how quickly something could be secured, what the process looked like if I moved fast. Then I asked about movers, about timelines, about what was realistic and what wasn't. The conversation stayed practical, grounded, almost boring in its simplicity. And that was what told me this wasn't an emotional reaction. This was planning. Caleb gave me information options, details I wrote down carefully, and when the call ended, I sat there again in the same quiet house that hadn't changed at all. No one had noticed what I'd just uncovered. Nothing in the room looked different. But I felt the shift clearly, like a line had been crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. I wasn't thinking about making a statement or forcing anyone to recognize what I had done for them. I wasn't interested in leverage or confrontation. What mattered was that I finally saw the situation for what it was, stripped of excuses and softened language. Leaving didn't need to be loud to be permanent. It just needed to be intentional. I gathered the documents I'd pulled up, stacked them neatly, and put them somewhere safe, not out of fear, but out of certainty. When I finally turned off the light and went to bed, I didn't feel dramatic or heartbroken. I felt settled, the kind of calm that comes when a decision has already been made, even if no one else knows it yet. The morning unfolded in a rush, not chaotic but efficient, like everyone knew exactly what mattered and what didn't. Suitcases lined up by the door, phones charging on the counter, conversations overlapping without ever really meeting. I stood off to the side, coffee untouched in my hand, watching the house operate without needing my input, but fully expecting my compliance. Raymond moved through the space with purpose, checking the time, adjusting plans, reminding Joseph about flight details and timing, like the day revolved around his departure. When he finally addressed me, it wasn't to ask how I was feeling or whether I needed anything. It was to assign responsibility. He told me to keep an eye on the house, to make sure deliveries didn't sit outside too long, to water the plants, to handle anything that came up while they were gone. The way he said it made it clear this wasn't a favor, it was assumed. Gloria followed shortly after, placing a piece of paper on the counter beside me, a neatly written list of tasks broken down by days and priorities. She said it would help keep things organized, and walked away before I could even respond, already focused on something Joseph had said about luggage space. I glanced at the list and felt nothing dramatic, just the weight of recognition, because this was how it always worked. Raymond noticed my quiet and, almost as if anticipating resistance, said this wasn't about choosing sides or favoring anyone, that it was simply practical. The word hung in the air, practical, as if fairness and emotional cost were irrelevant details in a decision reduced to convenience. Joseph didn't react at all, barely looking up from his phone as he scrolled through photos he planned to post, talking about lighting angles and timing, like the trip had already begun online. He was invested in how everything would look once they arrived, not in what was being left behind. No one asked if I was okay with staying, if the arrangement felt heavy, or if being practical always seemed to land on the same person. The house stayed loud and busy until it didn't. Shoes were slipped on, final reminders were exchanged, and then the door closed behind them with a decisive click. The sound of the car pulling away faded quickly, leaving a stillness that felt deliberate rather than empty. I stayed where I was for a moment, then slowly turned and looked at the house without people filling it. Stripped of movement and conversation, it didn't feel like a home. It felt like a ledger. Every room representing something I managed, maintained, or paid to keep functional. The kitchen appliances, the living room furniture, the services that made the place comfortable, all of it quietly pointed back to me. I walked through the rooms once, not out of sentimentality, but because I finally understood what I was seeing. This wasn't a space I shared equally, it was a structure built on my consistency and treated as a given. I returned to the kitchen and looked again at the list Gloria had left behind, the careful handwriting, the assumption embedded in every line. I didn't tear it up or throw it away. I placed it neatly back on the counter where she'd left it, knowing it no longer defined my role. I picked up my phone and checked the confirmation message for the movers, the time slot locked in, the details settled. Seeing it, there felt grounding, not reckless. This wasn't about reacting to being overlooked that morning. It was the continuation of a choice I had already made with clarity. I sat down, finished my cold coffee, and let the house sit exactly as it was, understanding that when the door closed behind them, they left more than just for a trip. They left the illusion that I would always be there to hold everything together. The movers arrived just after the sun cleared the rooftops, their truck pulling up with a low rumble that immediately shifted the air around the house, turning intention into motion. I let them in without hesitation and began pointing before anyone could ask questions. The couch first, then the TV, the shelves, the kitchen appliances. Every item I knew belonged to me because I had paid for it, maintained it, and kept the records to prove it. There was no anger in the process, no speech prepared, only clarity, as if my body already understood what needed to be done, and my mind simply followed. The movers worked quickly, wrapping furniture, lifting boxes, checking items off their list, while I moved from room to room with my phone in hand, canceling services, transferring accounts, detaching my name from anything that would remain behind. Internet subscriptions utilities tied to me rather than the address. Each confirmation email felt like a quiet release, a thread cut cleanly instead of torn. Time pressed in from every direction, not as panic, but as awareness, because I knew they could come back sooner than planned, and every hour mattered. I kept glancing toward the windows, not expecting them, but measuring how much daylight I had left to finish without interference. As the house emptied its true shape, emerged rooms echoing walls, bare spaces stripped of the comfort that had always been attributed to family, but had quietly depended on my consistency. The living room looked smaller without the furniture I'd chosen. The kitchen felt colder without the appliances I'd replaced over time, and walking through it all felt less like leaving a home and more like closing out an account. When the last items were loaded, I signed the mover's paperwork, double-checked the inventory, and locked the door behind us without looking back. Following the truck to my new apartment felt surreal in its simplicity. Traffic lights, familiar streets. Nothing dramatic marking the shift except the fact that I wasn't turning back. The apartment itself was modest, clean, and quiet, exactly what I had wanted, a space that hadn't already decided who I was supposed to be inside it. The movers unloaded efficiently, setting things down where I directed, and within a short time the blank rooms began to resemble something livable. My couch against the wall, my boxes stacked neatly, my belongings contained within boundaries that belonged solely to me. After they left, the silence returned, but it was different here. Lighter, not weighted with expectation. I moved through the apartment slowly, not arranging everything, just enough to function, because this wasn't about comfort. Yet, it was about separation. Standing in the middle of the room, I checked my phone one final time, confirming that the last transfers had gone through, and that nothing else connected me to the old house. Notifications from earlier sat unread, but I didn't open them. I powered the phone down the screen, going dark in my hand, and placed it face down on the counter. Then I locked the door, tested it once, and let myself breathe. Not out of relief, but out of certainty. The race wasn't about beating anyone back to the house. It was about finishing before doubt could catch up, and in that moment, with the door locked and the noise cut off, I knew I had arrived exactly where I was supposed to be. They stepped inside, expecting the house to welcome them back, the way it always had, but instead it answered with a hollow stillness that made every footstep sound too loud. The absence hit before anyone spoke. The living room stripped down to empty walls and bare floor, no couch to drop luggage on. No familiar glow from a television, no signs that life had continued while they were gone. Raymond walked farther in, scanning the space with growing irritation, opening doors as if the furniture had been temporarily misplaced rather than intentionally removed. The kitchen felt wrong, immediately counters, exposed cabinets, oddly prominent appliances missing in a way that turned routine movements into confusion. Gloria reached for switches and handles out of habit, only to pause when nothing responded the way it should, her silence heavier than any outburst would have been. Joseph lingered near the doorway, phone already in his hand, instinctively framing shots before stopping, realizing there was nothing here that fit the image he wanted to project. Practical problems surfaced fast, stacking on top of shock. The internet failing to connect, services unavailable, simple comforts gone, forcing them to confront how much of the house's ease had depended on things they never thought about managing. Outside, the open door invited attention, neighbors slowing as they passed, glances lingering too long, curiosity turning into whispers before anyone could shut it down. Someone asked if everything was okay, and the question landed awkwardly because there was no explanation that didn't expose something uncomfortable. The house didn't look vandalized or chaotic. It looked deliberately emptied, and that distinction unsettled them more than disorder would have. My phone started vibrating almost immediately, a sharp contrast to the quiet on my end calls, stacking up messages following when no one answered, the urgency escalating with every unanswered attempt. I didn't check who it was. I didn't need to. Back at the house, confusion turned into frustration, voices overlapping as they tried to make sense of what they were seeing. Raymond talked about calling providers only to realize he didn't have access to accounts he'd never bothered to manage. Gloria started listing what was missing, then stopped when it became clear the list was longer than what remained. Joseph scrolled through his phone, distraction failing, as notifications from others started coming in, questions he wasn't prepared to answer. The house, once assumed to be stable and self-sustaining, now broadcasted neglect through its silence, and the attention from outside only sharpened the embarrassment. The calls to me slowed, replaced by frantic searching, drawers opened, old paperwork pulled out, emails skimmed for clues they'd ignored before. Details they had dismissed as unimportant suddenly mattered, confirmations, addresses, small hints that pointed away from the house and toward a reality they hadn't considered. Piece by piece they followed the trail, realizing this wasn't a misunderstanding or a reaction meant to scare them, but a clean, organized exit. By the time they traced my new address, the truth settled in that this wasn't about the trip or a single decision. It was about what happened when the one person holding everything together stopped doing it. My phone sat face down and silent beside me, untouched, while the noise of their realization stayed exactly where it belonged, outside a life I had already stepped out of. They found me the same day, not quietly, not cautiously, but with the kind of urgency that comes from losing control. The knock on my door was hard and impatient, echoing down the hallway before I even reached it. When I opened the door, Raymond didn't wait for permission, stepping forward with his anger already boiling over his voice, sharp as he demanded to know what I thought I was doing, how I could just disappear and leave them to deal with the mess I'd created. Gloria stood slightly behind him, visibly shaken, her eyes moving quickly around my apartment, as if she was searching for something familiar to ground herself, her panic barely contained beneath forced composure. Joseph followed last, arms crossed, annoyance written plainly on his face. Not confusion, not concern, just irritation at being inconvenienced. The space felt immediately crowded with their presence, their voices filling it the way they always had, but this time I didn't step aside or shrink back. Raymond kept talking, listing everything that had gone wrong since they got home: the missing furniture, the disconnected services, the embarrassment with the neighbors, framing it all as chaos I had caused, rather than consequences they were facing. Gloria tried to interrupt, asking how I could leave without saying anything, insisting they had been worried, but the word worried rang hollow now, surfacing only after comfort had disappeared. Joseph finally spoke, his tone dismissive and cutting, saying, "I didn't need to make everything so difficult, that families don't handle things this way, that I could have talked to them instead of blowing everything up." That sentence landed harder than anything Raymond had shouted. Not because it was loud, but because it revealed exactly how he saw the situation. I didn't respond immediately. I turned, walked to the counter, and picked up the folder I had prepared, setting it down between us with deliberate calm. One by one, I opened it, laying out receipts, statements, contracts, and confirmations, evidence of what I owned, what I paid for, and what had always been in my name. I explained without emotion, not defending myself, just stating facts, making it impossible to pretend this was theft or spite. As the papers spread out, their reactions shifted, not toward remorse, but calculation, anger, cooling into something tighter and more defensive. That was the moment the truth became impossible to ignore. They weren't furious because I had left. They were furious because everything I had quietly provided was gone, because the stability they took for granted now had a price they weren't prepared to pay. The realization hit me with a cold clarity that settled deep and steady. Raymond stopped yelling and started arguing logistics. Gloria looked overwhelmed by the scale of what she was seeing, and Joseph scoffed, muttering that I was being dramatic, that I didn't have to cut them off like this. That confirmed it. Not one of them asked how I was doing, why I felt pushed to leave, or what it had taken for me to walk away. Caleb appeared at the edge of the room, then drawn by the raised voices, his presence firm and grounding, and asked if there was a problem. I answered before anyone else could, saying everything was under control. I looked at my family and said what I needed to say, slowly and clearly, that I wasn't coming back, that I wasn't paying their bills, managing their household, or stepping in when things became inconvenient. I said this wasn't a punishment, and it wasn't up for discussion, it was a boundary. Raymond tried to push back. Gloria looked like she might cry, and Joseph shook his head, calling it unnecessary, but none of that changed the outcome. Caleb stepped forward and told them it was time to leave. They hesitated, stunned by the fact that someone else was enforcing what I had already decided, then turned and walked out, their frustration trailing behind them as the door closed. When the apartment finally went quiet again, I stood there without shaking, without regret, knowing that what hurt them most wasn't losing me but losing everything I had carried for them all along. What followed wasn't dramatic, it was inconvenient, expensive, and impossible to ignore. Without me, the house in Fishers didn't fall apart emotionally, it broke down in ways that exposed how much had been quietly propped up. Bills went unpaid because no one tracked them closely. Services were interrupted because accounts required attention they had never learned to give, and small issues escalated into larger ones when no one intervened early. Raymond tried to take control, but competence doesn't appear just because responsibility finally does, and the routines he had relied on without noticing weren't easy to replace. Gloria's stress showed in practical questions: who to call, what to prioritize, how to handle costs she had never managed before, and the confidence she once had was replaced by hesitation. The dependence that had been invisible while I was there became obvious the moment I stopped absorbing it. Joseph felt the loss in a different way. Without the quiet support I had always provided, transportation payments, flexibility, and favors he assumed were normal stopped materializing. Plans stalled, opportunities narrowed, and, when things didn't work out the way he expected, frustration turned outward. He talked about unfairness and bad timing, never about preparation or effort, and the absence of a safety net forced him to confront consequences he had never carried on his own. I didn't witness any of this directly. I didn't need to. I focused on building something separate, something stable without noise. I finished settling into my apartment, established routines that didn't revolve around anyone else's needs, and let the space become mine in a way the old house never had been. I changed my number, updated my records, and closed the last open channels quietly without announcements or explanations. Messages stopped because there was nowhere left to send them, and that silence wasn't accidental. It was intentional. There was no reconciliation, no slow easing back into contact, no final conversation to soften the break. I didn't check in, didn't wait for apologies, didn't monitor outcomes. The distance itself did the work, exposing patterns that words had never changed. Over time, it became clear that what they missed wasn't me, it was the stability I had provided without recognition. Removing myself forced everyone to confront what had been sustained by my effort alone, and that realization came with discomfort they couldn't redirect or deny. I didn't feel guilty for stepping away. I felt precise. Cutting contact wasn't about punishment, it was about ending a system that required my silence to function. I didn't go back to Fishers, not for visits, not for holidays, not to prove a point. That chapter closed without ceremony, without argument, and without reopening. My life moved forward quietly, not perfect, but balanced, built on choices that didn't depend on being needed to justify my place. The silence that followed wasn't emptiness, it was space I hadn't had before. Space that stayed intact, because I didn't fill it with explanations or second chances. Some endings don't arrive with closure conversations or shared understanding. They arrive when one person stops compensating and lets reality take over. I didn't return to smooth things out, and I didn't need to. Fishers became a place I no longer belonged to, and the separation held because it was complete. What remained was distance without bitterness, silence without regret, and a life that no longer required me to disappear inside it to keep it running. Thank you all for taking the time to watch the video. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any upcoming videos.